Emma was a 16-year-old girl with a kind heart and a bright smile. She had been born with a physical disability that made walking difficult, but she never let it stop her from enjoying life. With the help of her service dog, Max, she loved taking evening walks around her quiet neighborhood. The fresh air, the gentle rustling of leaves, and the soft chirping of birds made her feel peaceful. That evening, the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon. Emma stepped out of her house, her father still at work, and her mother busy in the kitchen. Holding onto Max's leash, she made her way down the sidewalk, enjoying the cool breeze against her face. The streets weren't too busy, and most people were either inside their homes or finishing up their evening routines. As she reached the intersection near a small park, Emma stopped and looked both ways. It was a habit her father had taught her since she was little. Always check before crossing, even if it's a quiet street. A stop sign stood at the corner, reminding drivers to slow down. Seeing no cars coming, she took a step forward, Max staying right by her side. Suddenly, the distant sound of an engine grew louder. Emma turned her head just in time to see a police car speeding toward the intersection. It was moving fast, much faster than it should have been in a residential area. Her heart pounded as she realized the car wasn't slowing down. The stop sign was right there, but the vehicle wasn't stopping. Before she could react, the police car brushed against her, knocking her off balance. She fell onto the pavement, her body hitting the ground with a painful thud. Max barked loudly, circling her protectively, but Emma barely heard him. Pain shot through her leg and arm, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The world around her blurred as she tried to process what had just happened. The police car screeched to a stop a few feet away. A tall, uniformed officer stepped out, his face showing more annoyance than concern. It was Sergeant Blake, a man known in the neighborhood for his strict attitude. He walked toward Emma, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked, but his tone didn't sound genuinely worried. Emma tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in her arm. Max stayed close, his tail down, sensing that something was wrong. A few people from nearby houses stepped outside, drawn by the noise. Some had seen what happened, while others were just curious. Instead of checking to see if she was hurt, Blake sighed and looked at the road as if he was the one who had been inconvenienced. "You should be more careful," he said, shaking his head. "You can't just walk into the street like that." Emma's eyes widened. Had he really just blamed her? She had done everything right. She had checked both ways, and the stop sign was clear. It wasn't her fault that he hadn't slowed down. But before she could say anything, a woman from across the street spoke up. "I saw everything. You didn't stop at the sign," she called out. "She was already crossing, and you were driving too fast." A few others nodded in agreement, murmuring among themselves. Blake's jaw tightened. For a second, he looked like he wanted to argue, but he quickly turned back to Emma. "Do you need an ambulance?" he asked, his tone stiff. Emma swallowed hard. Her leg hurt, but she didn't know if it was broken. Her heart was still racing, and her mind was spinning. Before she could answer, someone else pulled out their phone. "I think we should call someone," a man said. "She needs help." Emma didn't know it yet, but someone had already called her father, and he was on his way. Sergeant Blake stood with his arms crossed, looking down at Emma as she struggled to sit up. His face showed no real concern, just impatience, as if he had more important things to do. The small crowd that had gathered around murmured in low voices. Some looked at Emma with worry, while others gave Blake questioning glances. They had seen what happened. They knew it wasn't her fault. Emma winced as she tried to move her leg. Pain shot up from her ankle to her knee, and she bit her lip to stop herself from crying out. Max stayed close to her, his warm brown eyes full of worry. He licked her hand gently, as if trying to comfort her. Emma reached out and stroked his head, grateful for his presence. Blake sighed and ran a hand through his short hair. "Listen, kid," he said, his voice flat. "You should be paying more attention. You can't just step into the street like that." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion. "But I checked," she said, her voice shaking. A woman in the crowd interrupted, her voice sharp. "She was already crossing when you came speeding through. You didn't stop at the sign." Another man nodded. "That's right. We all saw it." Blake's jaw tightened. He turned toward the small group of people, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it looked like he was going to argue, but then he shook his head. "I don't have time for this," he muttered under his breath. Emma's heart pounded. Why was he acting like this? Shouldn't a police officer be more responsible? Shouldn't he at least check if she was okay before blaming her? Her legs still hurt, and her arm felt sore from the fall, but Blake didn't seem to care. A young man standing nearby pulled out his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance," he said. "She looks hurt." Blake turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "That's not necessary. I can handle this." But the man ignored him and stepped aside to make the call. Emma felt relieved that someone was taking her seriously. She didn't know how bad her injuries were, but she knew she needed medical help. Just then, another woman pulled out her phone as well. "I'm recording this," she said, "in case this doesn't get reported properly." Blake stiffened. His eyes flicked toward the phone, and for the first time, he looked uneasy. He cleared his throat and took a step back. "Fine," he said. "An ambulance is coming. Let's just wait." Emma glanced at the faces around her. People were standing up for her, but she still felt small and powerless. If her father were here, he would know what to do. He always told her to stay calm in difficult situations, but right now, it was hard. Then, as if reading her thoughts, a woman in the crowd asked, "Does someone need to call your parents, sweetheart?" Emma hesitated, but before she could answer, a man near the back of the group spoke. "I already did," he said. "I know her dad. He's on his way." Blake frowned. "Who's her father?" The man glanced at Emma. "Daniel," he said simply. Blake's expression didn't change at first, but then something flickered in his eyes. He turned back to Emma, his posture suddenly a little stiffer. "Daniel?" he repeated, as if the name sounded familiar. Emma didn't say anything. She just nodded. Blake's face remained neutral, but his fingers twitched at his sides. He looked away for a moment, as if deep in thought. Then he cleared his throat. "Well," he said, his voice quieter now, "let's just wait for the ambulance." But Emma could tell something had changed. Blake didn't know yet, but he had made a big mistake. Her father wasn't just any man. And soon, Blake was going to find out exactly who he was dealing with. Daniel drove fast, but carefully, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. He had received a call just minutes ago, telling him that his daughter, Emma, had been hit by a police car. The words kept repeating in his mind, making his heart pound with worry. Emma was strong, but she was still just a 16-year-old girl. And now she was hurt. He had been in the middle of an important meeting when his phone rang. The moment he heard the panicked voice on the other end, everything else faded. He didn't even wait to explain. He just grabbed his coat and rushed out. Nothing mattered more than his daughter. As he turned onto the street where the accident happened, he saw the flashing lights of an ambulance and a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. His eyes immediately found Emma, sitting on the ground with her service dog, Max, by her side. A paramedic was kneeling next to her, checking her leg. She looked pale, and there was pain in her eyes, but she was awake. That gave him a little relief. Daniel parked quickly and stepped out, his tall figure moving through the crowd with purpose. People stepped aside as he approached, sensing his urgency. His eyes flickered toward the police car parked nearby, then to the officer standing a few feet away. Daniel didn't need to ask who he was. He could tell by the nervous way the man shifted his weight. This was the officer who had hit Emma. He went straight to his daughter, kneeling beside her and touching her shoulder gently. "Emma," he said, his voice calm but filled with concern. "I'm here." Emma looked up at him, her eyes welling with tears, not just from pain, but from everything she had been through in the last half hour. "Dad," she whispered, "he said it was my fault." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression steady. "Are you in a lot of pain?" Emma nodded slightly. "My leg hurts, and my arm, but I don't think anything's broken." The paramedic beside her spoke. "She has some bruising and swelling, but we'll take her to the hospital to make sure nothing is fractured." Daniel gave the paramedic a small nod of thanks, then turned his gaze toward the officer. His sharp, calculating eyes took in every detail: his uniform, his badge, and most importantly, his face. Sergeant Blake met his stare, but shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, are you the officer who hit my daughter?" Daniel asked, his voice low and steady. Blake hesitated. "It was an accident," he said quickly. "She was crossing, and I—" "You ran a stop sign," a voice from the crowd interrupted. It was the same woman who had spoken up earlier. "We all saw it." Daniel didn't take his eyes off Blake. "Is that true?" Blake swallowed, his confidence wavering. I might have misjudged the stop," he admitted. "But You blamed her," Daniel cut in, his tone harder now. "Before even checking if she was okay, you told a 16-year-old girl that she was at fault." Blake opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, unable to find the right words. One of the other officers who had arrived as backup took a cautious step forward. "Sir, if we could just discuss this calmly." "I am calm," Daniel said, his voice even, but there was something in his tone that made everyone around him take notice. "But I expect accountability. And I expect the truth." Blake shifted again. "Look, I didn't know." "You didn't know she was my daughter." Daniel finished for him. "And that would have made a difference." Blake looked away, realizing he had said too much. Daniel took a deep breath and straightened. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," he said. "And I want the dashcam and bodycam footage reviewed immediately." Blake's face turned pale. He had handled many situations before, but this was different. He hadn't just hit a girl. He had hit the daughter of an FBI agent. And now he was in serious trouble. The street had grown quiet. The crowd still stood around, but now they weren't just watching out of curiosity. They were waiting to see what would happen next. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Sergeant Blake, who had been so dismissive earlier, now looked unsure. His confident stance had shifted, his shoulders slightly tense. He had realized too late that this wasn't a situation he could brush aside. Daniel, standing tall, looked straight at Blake. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, studying every move the officer made. He had spent years reading people, knowing when they were lying, when they were nervous, when they were trying to cover something up. And right now, he could see it all in Blake's face. "You said it was an accident," Daniel said, his voice steady. "That's fine. Accidents happen, but how you handled it after is what concerns me." Blake cleared his throat. "Sir, You blamed my daughter," Daniel continued, not letting him finish. "You didn't check if she was hurt. You didn't even follow basic protocol. Instead, you tried to shift the responsibility onto a 16-year-old girl." Blake opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel raised a hand slightly. "No excuses. I want to see the bodycam footage. Now." Blake hesitated, glancing toward the other officers who had arrived as backup. One of them, a younger officer, shifted uncomfortably before stepping forward. "Sir, the footage is automatically recorded," he explained. "It can be reviewed at the station." Daniel nodded. "Then we'll go there." Blake's face paled slightly. He knew what the footage would show. The stop sign, the speed, his reaction afterward. There was no way to twist the truth now. Emma, still sitting on the ground with the paramedics tending to her, looked up at her father. Even though she was in pain, seeing him take charge made her feel safe. She had always admired how he never let injustice go unanswered. Blake exhaled sharply, "Look, sir, I didn't realize that she was my daughter," Daniel asked. "And if she were someone else's daughter, would you have handled it the same way?" Blake's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer. Daniel turned to one of the backup officers. "What's the standard procedure when a pedestrian is hit by a vehicle?" The young officer hesitated, glancing at Blake before answering. The officer involved should immediately check for injuries, call for medical assistance, and file an official report." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And did that happen here?" The officer swallowed hard. "No, sir." The crowd murmured again. Some people shook their heads. Others whispered among themselves. They had all seen what happened. They knew Daniel was right. Blake sighed, running a hand over his face. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice lower now. "I should have handled it differently." Daniel didn't let up. "And what are you going to do about it?" Before Blake could respond, one of the paramedics spoke up. "Sir, we need to take Emma to the hospital now." Daniel immediately turned back to his daughter. Her face was still pale, and she winced as they carefully moved her onto the stretcher. He reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "I'll be right behind you," he assured her. Emma nodded, her eyes trusting. As the ambulance doors closed, Daniel straightened and looked back at Blake. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "I'll be filing a report, and I'll make sure it's handled properly." Blake didn't argue this time. He only nodded stiffly as Daniel turned and walked toward his car. The officer had made a mistake, one he couldn't undo. And now, the truth was going to come out, whether he was ready for it or not. Daniel followed closely behind the ambulance, his mind racing with thoughts. He had always taught Emma to be strong, to stand up for herself, but she was just a teenager. She shouldn't have had to deal with this alone. The way Sergeant Blake had acted, careless, dismissive, and then nervous when he realized who Emma's father was, did not sit right with him. As they reached the hospital, Daniel parked his car and rushed inside. Emma was already being taken to the emergency room, with doctors and nurses surrounding her. Max, her loyal service dog, waited anxiously in the lobby, his tail down as if he could sense her pain. A nurse approached Daniel. "Sir, your daughter is in good hands. The doctor will check her injuries, and will update you soon." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." He turned to Max and gave him a reassuring pat. The dog looked up at him with trusting eyes. Max had always been Emma's protector, and right now, Daniel felt the same responsibility, to protect her, not just from physical harm, but from injustice. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally came out. "Mr. Daniel." Daniel immediately stood up. "Yes. How is she?" The doctor gave a small smile. "She's going to be okay. There are no fractures, just some deep bruising and a sprained ankle. She'll need rest and some physical therapy, but she will recover." Daniel let out a breath of relief. "Can I see her?" "Of course." He walked into the hospital room, where Emma lay on the bed, her leg wrapped in a soft brace. She looked tired, but smiled when she saw him. "Hey, Dad." Daniel sat beside her. "Hey, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" Emma shrugged. "Sore, but I'll be fine." Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm going to make sure this is handled properly. That officer, he's not going to get away with this." Emma looked at him carefully. I don't want this to happen to someone else, Dad." Daniel's expression softened. His daughter was always thinking about others, even when she was the one hurt. He nodded. "It won't. I promise." Just then, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from one of his colleagues at the FBI. They had already begun looking into Sergeant Blake's record, and what they had found was troubling. Blake had been involved in several complaints before, cases where he had been accused of reckless driving, aggressive behavior, and mishandling situations. But each time, the complaints had quietly disappeared, brushed under the rug by the department. Daniel's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about Emma. This was about a pattern, one that had been ignored for too long. He turned back to Emma. "You don't need to worry about this anymore. Just focus on healing." Emma nodded, trusting him. But Daniel knew what he had to do next. Sergeant Blake wasn't just going to walk away from this. The truth was coming, and this time, no one was going to cover it up. The days that followed were a blur for Daniel. He spent most of his time at the hospital with Emma, making sure she was comfortable and recovering well. Her sprained ankle was causing her pain, and her bruises made her tired, but she was slowly getting better. Daniel stayed close, offering comfort and support, his mind constantly shifting between his daughter's recovery and the justice he promised her. Emma was strong, but this experience had shaken her. She had always trusted police officers, believing they were there to protect people. But now she was learning a difficult lesson, that not everyone who wore a uniform was worthy of that trust. It hurt her deeply, but she refused to let it change who she was. She didn't want to live in fear or anger. Instead, she focused on getting better, knowing her father would handle the rest. Daniel, however, wasn't going to let it slide. He couldn't. The more he thought about what happened, the angrier he became. It wasn't just about Emma. It was about the people who hadn't been held accountable for their actions, the system that allowed it to happen time and time again. Blake wasn't just one officer. He was part of a culture of negligence that had hurt too many people in the past. Daniel wasn't going to let that continue. He called his colleagues at the FBI, and they began investigating Blake's record more thoroughly. As they dug deeper, they found disturbing patterns of misconduct. Blake had been involved in other accidents, some where people had been hurt, but nothing ever came of it. Complaints about his reckless driving, his aggressive behavior during routine traffic stops, and his general disregard for safety had piled up, but none of them had led to serious consequences. It was as though the system was protecting him. Daniel knew that Blake's career needed to be scrutinized, but he also knew the public needed to see the truth. It was time for people to know what had been happening behind closed doors. He contacted the local news stations and shared the details of the investigation. It didn't take long before the story made its way into the headlines. The community, already on edge about police transparency, began to take notice. People started questioning the department's practices, and Blake found himself under intense scrutiny. Meanwhile, Emma's condition was improving. She was still using crutches to move around, but her sprained ankle was healing faster than expected. The bruises on her arms and legs were fading, though they still served as painful reminders of the day her life had been turned upside down. Despite her physical recovery, there was a lingering unease in her heart. It wasn't just the accident. It was the fear that the world might not be as safe as she had once believed. One afternoon, while Daniel was sitting with her in her hospital room, they received an unexpected visitor. It was the woman who had spoken up during the incident, the one who had witnessed the accident firsthand and had called out Blake's actions. She was holding a small box in her hands. "I'm so sorry this happened to you, Emma," the woman said, her voice sincere. "I saw everything, and I just couldn't stand by and let that officer get away with it. You didn't deserve this." Emma gave her a small smile. "Thank you for speaking up. It means a lot to me." The woman handed Emma the box. "I brought you something," she said, "just a little something to make you feel better." Inside the box was a necklace, simple yet beautiful, with a small silver pendant in the shape of a heart. Emma looked up at the woman, confused. "It's a symbol of strength," the woman explained. "It's a reminder that you're not alone in this. There are people who care, people who are willing to stand up for what's right." Emma's eyes welled with tears. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words, to know that there were still good people in the world who would fight for justice. It wasn't just her father. She had a community behind her, people who would stand with her and support her, no matter what. Daniel, watching the exchange, felt a sense of pride in his daughter. She was learning a hard lesson, but she was doing it with grace and courage. He knew this experience would shape her into someone even stronger, and he would be there every step of the way. helping her heal and ensuring that the person responsible for her pain would be held accountable. The fight wasn't over, but Daniel knew that, together, they could make sure that justice would prevail. As the weeks went by, the media coverage surrounding the incident grew. More and more people began to speak out about Sergeant Blake's behavior. The local news stations interviewed witnesses, and the investigation into Blake's past incidents was making headlines. The public had begun to demand accountability from the police department. Blake, who had once carried himself with such confidence, now found himself backed into a corner. Daniel knew that the road ahead would be long. His position as an FBI agent meant that he had to navigate the delicate balance of personal involvement and professional conduct. He didn't want his actions to seem driven by personal vendetta. He simply wanted justice for his daughter and the community. But as the story gained more traction, it became clear that this wasn't just about Emma anymore. This was about the systemic problems in the police force that allowed officers like Blake to repeatedly escape responsibility. Blake was put on administrative leave, pending further investigation. His badge and gun were taken from him, and he was ordered to stay away from the police station. The news of his suspension sent shockwaves through the department. It was rare for an officer to be removed from duty like this, especially without clear, irrefutable evidence. But Blake's history of complaints, his reckless driving, his abuse of authority, and now the incident with Emma, made it hard for the department to ignore. Emma's recovery continued, though the emotional toll weighed heavily on her. She was slowly getting back to her usual routine, but every time she saw a police officer or heard a siren in the distance, a knot formed in her stomach. It wasn't just the pain from the accident. It was the realization that her world had shifted in a way she hadn't expected. One afternoon, Emma sat in her room, her crutches leaning against the bed. She had just finished her physical therapy exercises and was catching up on some homework. Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her, and she reached for it absent-mindedly. It was a text from her best friend, Mia. "How are you doing? I heard the news about Blake. Are you okay?" Emma paused before responding, her fingers hovering over the screen. She could still remember the fear and confusion she felt that day on the street, sitting on the pavement while Blake stood there, dismissing her pain. But she wasn't that scared girl anymore. She had learned a lot in the past few weeks. She had learned about standing up for herself, about fighting for what was right, even when it was hard. "I'm doing better," Emma typed. "It's been tough, but I'm learning to be stronger. Thanks for checking in." Mia quickly replied, "You're so brave, Emma. We're all here for you." Reading Mia's words made Emma smile. It was moments like this, simple messages of support, that reminded her of the good in the world. There were people who cared about her, who were rooting for her. Later that evening, Daniel sat down with Emma in the living room after dinner. It had become their tradition to sit together, talking about everything and nothing ever since the accident. It was their way of reconnecting after a busy day, a time for father and daughter to relax and share their thoughts. "How are you feeling?" Daniel asked gently. Emma glanced at him, smiling. "I'm good. My ankle's getting better. I still get tired sometimes, but I'm managing." "That's good to hear," Daniel said. He paused for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking about what comes next." Emma raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Well," Daniel began, leaning forward slightly, "the investigation is moving forward. The department is starting to take this seriously, and I'm going to make sure the right people are held accountable, not just for what happened to you, but for everything that led up to it." Emma nodded. "I know you'll make sure of that, Dad. But I don't want this to be about revenge. I just want things to change." Daniel smiled, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. "That's exactly what I want too, Emma. It's not about getting back at anyone. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. For you, for everyone." The next morning, Daniel woke up early, his mind already focused on the next step in the process. He had made a promise to Emma, and to himself, that he wouldn't let this go. He called his colleagues at the FBI and discussed how they could move forward with pressing charges against Blake. They had gathered enough evidence to prove that Blake had been negligent, and now it was time to ensure that he faced the consequences. The road ahead would be long, but Daniel knew one thing for sure. No matter how hard it got, he wasn't going to stop fighting for what was right. For his daughter, for the community, and for the people who didn't have the voice to stand up for themselves. The day of the hearing finally arrived. Daniel had prepared for this moment, but as he sat in the small, quiet room at the courthouse, he couldn't shake the nervousness that still lingered. He had done everything he could to gather the evidence, interview witnesses, and work alongside the investigators. But now, it was up to the judge to determine what would happen to Sergeant Blake. It wasn't just a case of one officer's wrongdoing. It had become a symbol of the need for change within the police department and the justice system. Daniel knew this wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about the broader implications for the community. Emma, still recovering from the physical trauma, had chosen to stay home that day. She had made it clear to Daniel that she didn't want to be present in the courtroom. She had already gone through so much, and hearing the details of the incident again felt too overwhelming. She trusted her father to handle it, and he respected her wishes. At the courthouse, the room filled with people, witnesses, reporters, and lawyers all waiting for the proceedings to begin. Daniel stood in the corner, listening as whispers traveled through the room. People were talking about the case. They were talking about Blake. Word had spread, and the public was paying attention. This wasn't just a small-town matter anymore. It had become a discussion about accountability, responsibility, and how far the law should go to protect those it served. When the doors to the courtroom finally opened, Daniel stepped inside and took his seat. He felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders, but he held his head high. He wasn't here to seek vengeance. He was here to make sure that justice was served. The judge, a stern but fair woman, called the case to order. Sergeant Blake was seated at the defendant's table, his expression guarded. His lawyer sat next to him, reviewing the notes. Blake's eyes shifted toward Daniel, as if he recognized him for the first time. His demeanor suddenly less confident, more tense. Daniel tried not to focus on him too much. His attention was on the proceedings, not on Blake's discomfort. The prosecutor presented the evidence, laying out the timeline of the incident. Witnesses had described Blake's actions in detail, how he had failed to properly assess the situation after hitting Emma, how he had ignored the basic steps of protocol that he was supposed to follow. The body cam footage had shown his hurried actions and dismissive attitude toward Emma, despite her clear distress. Daniel's heart tightened as the footage played in the courtroom. He had watched it countless times, but seeing it again, seeing his daughter in pain, with no one to advocate for her in that moment, brought a wave of emotion. He tried to keep his composure, but it was difficult. His desire for justice wasn't just professional, it was personal. After the footage, the witnesses testified. One by one, they spoke about what they had seen. There was the woman who had stopped to help, the bystanders who had called 911, and the paramedics who had arrived on the scene. They all painted a clear picture of an officer who had acted recklessly, a person who had abused their power and ignored the safety of others. Blake's lawyer attempted to defend him, arguing that the situation had been a tragic accident and that Blake had not intended to hurt Emma. They suggested that he had been overwhelmed in the moment, that his actions weren't malicious. But the more they spoke, the less convincing their arguments seemed. Finally, it was Daniel's turn to speak. He stood up and addressed the court, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here today because my daughter was hurt, not just physically, but emotionally. And while the wounds on her body will heal, the impact of this incident will stay with her for a long time. What happened that day was more than an accident. It was a failure of responsibility, a failure to protect. And it wasn't just my daughter who suffered. It was everyone who trusted that officer to do his job right." His words echoed in the courtroom, and he could see some of the jurors nodding. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about the bigger picture, about how those in power needed to be held accountable for their actions. When the hearing finally ended, the judge announced that the case would be reviewed further and a final decision would be made in the coming days. The room was quiet as people filed out, the tension still thick in the air. Daniel knew that this wasn't the end. There would be more steps, more challenges ahead. But today, he had taken another step toward justice for Emma, and for everyone who had been affected by Blake's actions. As Daniel left the courthouse, he received a call from Emma. Her voice came through clearly, though there was a slight tremor in her words. "Dad, how did it go?" Daniel smiled softly. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. We're one step closer." Emma sighed with relief. "I knew you'd make sure of that." Daniel's heart swelled with pride. His daughter was stronger than he had ever realized, and now, together, they would see this through to the end. This wasn't just about a single case. It was about making sure that something like this would never happen again, and he was ready to keep fighting, no matter what it took.